Good evening, everyone. Hello. Good evening. I'm Catherine Tompkins, board chair of the Greenwich Historical Society, and I am so pleased. Thank you, Peter. I'm so pleased to welcome you here tonight to the 2025 History in the Making Awards. And it's nice to see so many old friends and supporters, as well as new friends. And I think I even see George Washington back there. Is that you, Mr. President? All right, well, we take our mission very seriously here, bringing history to life. And George is here, Mr. President Washington, is here to wet everyone's whistle for America 250, which is coming up next year. And yes, reason to get excited. And you'll be hearing more about our plans with respect to that a little bit later. On behalf of the board, I am so thrilled to welcome you here to celebrate our 2025 History in the Making honoree, our esteemed former executive director and CEO for 30 years, Debra Mecky. This award recognizes outstanding individuals who influence Greenwich's history, and Debra is a shining example of this. Her incredible tenure, which has significantly shaped our community, is a testament to her leadership and to her commitment to our town. What a legacy. We are also delighted to welcome award-winning author and maritime historian Nathaniel Philbrick as tonight's featured speaker. Yes. We extend our heartfelt thanks to our event sponsors, Blavatnik Family Foundation, Dalio Philanthropies, Moffley Media, and RSR Partners. Your support is truly appreciated. We also express our sincere appreciation to our platinum patrons and to the many donors listed in this evening's program. Your generosity is absolutely vital to our fulfilling our mission here in the community. Thank you to tonight's co-chairs, Isabel and Peter Malkin, Debbie and Russ Reynolds, and Mallory and Greg Mollenkamp. Per usual, you have gone above and beyond an absolutely beautiful setting for us here tonight. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the impact of our board. And to my fellow board members, it is such a pleasure to serve with all of you. I'm going to embarrass you and ask you to please stand tonight, all of our board members of the Historical Society. Thank you. Thank you for the round of applause for this group who's just been tremendously generous and shown terrific leadership. So thank you to the board. And of course, I'd like to thank our fantastic staff at the Historical Society for their invaluable part in pulling together this special event and for what you do year round. So thank you to our staff. This summer, we were fortunate to welcome our new executive director and CEO, Carol Cadu. Carol joins us at a pivotal moment in our growth, and I know that we're all looking forward to hearing from Carol later in the evening. To update you on some important initiatives, in 2023, we embarked on the planning phase of our Greenwich Past, Present, Future Capital campaign, and you'll also be hearing a little bit more about that from Carol. As always, we are eager to share the details of our upcoming campaigns and events with all of you, our loyal supporters. So to begin tonight's program and to highlight this evening's theme, please sit back, relax, and enjoy a video on the coastal history of Greenwich. Enjoy.
When it comes to understanding the history of Greenwich, you really have to start with the coast because that's how people first arrived here. The Native American population here made use of the coast probably for thousands of years. Greenwich Point was called Monocoego.
Monocoego was a Native American name and it meant shining sands. In 1640, the colonists arrived from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They bought this land from the Native Americans, all of the Greenwich Point, and going landward, called Elizabeth's Neck, was sold to the two gentlemen, Robert Feek and Daniel Patrick, plus Robert Feek's wife, Elizabeth.
It was actually in Elizabeth's name, and that was very unusual for the time.
Settlements required fertile land, and the coastline provided great pasture and grazing. The access to tide mills and sawmills, critical. Old Greenwich was much surpassed in the history of the town because it really did not have a good harbor for the packet boats. So Cos Cob, Indian Harbor, and Byram become really vital areas for trade and industry and commerce to grow. The Miamis River, it's a vital river. Two of the town's most important landings were on it, the lower landing and the upper landing, one where the highway now crosses and there's a bridge, and the lower landing where you come close to where the Bush Holly House is and where the Bush family for over 3 generations ran their tide mill. They built a business there.
Not only was it a kind of a nexus for people to bring goods for export to New York City and further afield, but also to have raw material brought in for people who lived in Greenwich.
Greenwich really was a frontier town on the front lines of the Revolutionary War. 3 of its 4 borders bordered the British held territories, and it's only 3 miles across Long Island Sound to British-held New York. So it was really in a very dangerous, precarious position. In February 1779, General Tryon comes here to Greenwich to destroy the salt works. These were built here on the Miamis River, salt for preserving meat for the Continental Army. And if you can destroy the salt works, you're going to starve the army. Fields are destroyed, houses are burned. It's a devastating event, and that's what leads to a really pivotal moment in the Bush family history when David Bush is arrested, suspicion of being a loyalist because none of his property has been damaged or destroyed by the British. By the time the Holly family come and they buy this dilapidated but large 18th century house that had once belonged to the Bushes, they're going to turn this into a boarding house, but it's the location on the water. It's so important to what they're going to be doing here. Cos Cob is the home of American Impressionism because it attracted 4 people who are part of the founders of American Impressionism. What happens here that changes the art world in America is that Theodore Robinson had worked in France for years, living next door to Monet, painting alongside Monet. So when he returns to America and he comes to Cos Cob to stay here with his friends, they're all working outdoors together, painting these landscapes. They're pushing one another out of their comfort zone. And that's what's really so radical and pivotal about the Cos Cob Art Colony, is it creates this new type of art. What makes them so special is that students were invited to come to this art colony. John Henry Twachtman is teaching the next generation of American artists who will be the leaders of modernism.
In the middle of the 19th century, the Greenwich coast is discovered by quite a different set of people. Boss Tweed is sometimes credited with being the first of the millionaires to come and discover the coastline and build his great hotel and home. Although that ended in infamy, that really became the story of the late 19th and early 20th century. a period of the Gilded Age, a period when what we call the Gold Coast sometimes, with people coming to build these wonderful, beautiful coastal first hotels and then staying year-round, and then moving inland and taking the old farms and turning them into gentlemen's estates.
As people came here full-time, they wanted social outlet, and I think that's what led to the development of the yacht club.
Indian Harbor was formed on July 1st, 1889 by 5 members who were all staying at the nearby Sillick House right here on Steamboat Road. Eventually, Commodore Wills, he put together the money and bought this land on the tip of Steamboat Road, and he built the first clubhouse in 1897. Within 30 years, it had somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen races per summer, which had up to 31 boats enter it. Since that time, Indian Harbor has evolved into a national sailing powerhouse.
George Tyson decided to have this be his summer home, and he bought property down here. And in 1888, he called 10 of his good friends, and he invited them to his house to discuss whether we could form a yacht club. I mean, you see a lot of traditions. We dress like the military. We have ceremonies like the military. We have cannons like the military. We always say we're sailing, but we're very importantly community, and we're very importantly family.
There were 5 particular families that were pretty keen on incorporating the club. It was incorporated as the Greenwich Casino Association in 1889, and it was primarily formed for the people in the Belhaven Peninsula who could walk to the club, because that's what everybody did in those days. The wealthy titans of industry that lived in Greenwich would, park their boats out here in Captain's Harbor. We had instructors with last names like Perry and Dellenbaugh and Vernon and Hamill, some of the best sailors in the world. Our commissioning is probably one of the best, if not the best, choreographed commissioning on Long Island Sound, and it keeps to the traditions that go back 100 years for clubs.
History matters. How can you appreciate where you are now if you don't know where you've come from?
Our ability to, as a community, collect that history and make it tangible to people helps us be more powerful.
Being more informed makes life richer.
That was very informative and lovely. How beautiful is our town? Not too shabby, I would say. Yeah, it's really gorgeous. So in keeping with tradition, each year we invite the previous year's honoree to present the current year's History in the Making Award. The Mitchell family has had a tremendous impact on Greenwich for decades, and we were delighted to honor them with the 2024 History in the Making Award. Here with us tonight is Tyler Mitchell. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd love to invite you up to present this year's award.
Thank you, Catherine. On behalf of the entire Mitchell family, I want to just say what an honor it was to be acknowledged for this award last year. And if you're asking yourself, who is the Mitchell family? We own the store Richard's up on Greenwich Avenue. We came to Greenwich in 1995, so we've been here for 30 years. And giving back to the community has been a value my family has lived by forever. So I got to say, I'm in a very unique position at my job in that fishbowl on Greenwich Avenue, where I see hundreds of residents of Greenwich every day coming through there. Over the course of the week, it's over 1,000. And what an unbelievable community we live in. I have a lot of friends, yeah, please. I have a lot of friends who say, I don't know how you do what you do every day. Like, they must be the most impossible people, and we get the occasional pain in the ass, but I gotta tell you, the community in Greenwich is unbelievable. It is some of the nicest, smartest, most interesting, giving people I've ever met in my entire life. Yeah. And I have to say, I have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old. It is really nice to start teaching them about community. We live in backcountry, and every morning before school, I drive my daughter down to Greenwich Avenue to CFCF, not because they have great coffee, but because everybody says good morning Everybody says, would you like to pet my dog? The baristas know our name. And for me, showing my kids that we live in a community filled with kind people who give back it means everything to me. There's a great saying, the grass is not greener on the other side. It's green where you water it, right? And that's what tonight is about. That's what this award is about. So tonight, we are honoring Debra Mecky, who served as the executive director and CEO of the Historical Society since 1996. So 30 years. She is a distinguished museum professional who, during her tenure at the Historical Society, transformed the organization into a nationally recognized history museum. So before I call Debra to the stage, we're going to roll a quick 3-minute tribute video.
I joined the Greenwich Historical Society board in 1993. Debra arrived 3 years later, young, personable, and historian, a perfect fit. We were so grateful that she came to us with her skills, her training, and her charm.
Within a mere 5 years, she facilitated an impressive transformation of the campus. In her first year, she oversaw the restoration of the Justice Luke Bush Storehouse, and by 2002, the expansion of the historic barn to include the Vanderbilt Education Center, the award-winning dual interpretation of the Bush Holly House, and the entire historic landscape plan.
Debra was a guiding light and an inspiration for the project to reimagine the Greenwich Historical Society campus and a vital contributor to the success of that capital campaign.
When Bill Finch stepped down as leader of the Greenwich Historical Society, I thought it'd be impossible to replace him. Then Debra Mecky arrived and everything turned positive.
I continually marvel at her incredible ability to juggle details, events, staff, all of her responsibilities, usually about 7 days a week, with good humor and always a positive attitude.
Debra Mecky has been an outstanding leader. The organization has expanded its scope, strengthened its mission, and deepened its impact on our community with its many wonderful programs in education, the arts, and preservation. Her vision and dedication have left a lasting legacy.
Debra was a champion for the Title I program for low-income students and a firm believer in the power of local history and creative art education for students across Greenwich. By securing funding, she ensured that the cost of programming would not be a barrier for any school wishing to visit the Bush Holly House.
Debra was always a tremendous event partner. One of my favorite memories of Debra was working with her on Antiquarius, and especially on the house tour. That was always such a magical time of year. Debra was really at the center of it all, celebrating Greenwich Historical Society and really broadening our community reach.
Thank you, Debra!
Please welcome Debra Mecky to the stage to receive the 2025 History in the Making Award. Congratulations. We're going to step over here for a photo.
Okay. Thank you, Tyler, for your warm remarks. And thank you to the Greenwich Historical Society Board for this extraordinary honor. I am deeply moved by your recognition of me. I extend my gratitude to the Malkins, Mullenkamps, and Reynolds for planning this special evening, and I truly appreciate the work of the staff to execute on every detail to make the dinner a success. I also acknowledge my family and friends who joined me tonight to be part of this occasion. Thank you all for honoring me with your presence. I was blessed for nearly 3 decades to have perfect alignment between my passion and my job, and always believe that historic sites, museums, and historical societies deserve our support. It's what Nathaniel Philbrick so beautifully portrays in his recent book, Travels with George, and vividly brings to life in his narrative that history is all around us. And for those of us with the privilege of living in New England, the nation's founding and formation and evolution are preserved in innumerable places and artifacts and in the memories of local historians and storytellers in our towns and our cities. An unknown letter, a surprise encounter, the transformed landscape, the power of place. These are the things that excite the imagination of children and adults alike, and they expand our capacity to understand the past and change the future. I began my career when there was a greater appreciation and understanding of American history than there is today, which is why the work of the Greenwich Historical Society is so vital to our future and worthy of your support. I am delighted the Historical Society will take the lead in the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and is committed to education and the interpretation of our past. And I wish my successor, Carol Cadu, the deep satisfaction I have had through a long career at Greenwich Historical Society, during which I have seen the impact of our programs and exhibits have had on thousands of students and their families. Now, many people have supported me through the past almost 30 years. First of all, my husband, Carl Mecky. He attended every annual meeting and fundraising event, and more importantly, it was his encouragement and background as an architect and planner that laid the foundation back in 1998 for the master plan that blossomed over the years into the reimagined campus 20 years later. Peter Malkin gave all of us an enormous gift when he stepped up to chair the Capitol campaign and has become the Historical Society's biggest cheerleader. His wife, Isabel Malkin, is the organization's longest-serving member of the board and a great fan. And I have benefited from the work of many extraordinary board chairs and volunteers through the decades. Many of you are here tonight, and I truly thank you. I'm thinking of Claire Vanderbilt and Bill Crooks and Christopher Holbrook and Roberta Denning, Susan Larkin, Bruce Dixon, Haley Elmlinger, Catherine Tompkins, Robert Getz, to name a few of those who have embraced our mission and stood behind it through the many challenges of steering a nonprofit organization, and often gracefully pointing me in the right direction. Finally, I will always remember my time in Greenwich and the extraordinary staff and volunteers I have had the pleasure to work with. They have amazed me by their dedication, tenacity, and their creativity, and I admire them so greatly. This is not a farewell. I planned many visits to enjoy all the wonderful things that I know the future holds for the Greenwich Historical Society. Its ongoing success will be my best reward. Thank you.
I would just like to join the chorus of congratulations and thank you to Debra. And I know I'm not alone when I say that not only has Debra been a tremendous leader for us in this organization, in this community, but she's been an incredible friend to so many of us in this room. And we all are going to miss her. And I think she promised to stay in touch, so we will take her up on that. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our new Executive Director and CEO, Carol Cadieux. Carol has hit the ground running in Greenwich, and I can personally say that I have been delighted to welcome her and have been truly inspired by her passion for the arts, her creative ideas, and her deep historical knowledge. Carol not only exemplifies the American story through her broad experience, but her proven record of connecting communities to their history truly sets her apart. She comes to us from Washington, D.C., where she held a variety of impressive leadership positions, including at the Colonial Dames of America, Winterthur Museum, and Mount Vernon. I know so many of you have met her, and for those of you who have not, you're in for a treat. So without further ado, I'm going to let Carol come up and talk about some of the exciting things she has planned for the Historical Society as we turn the page and she builds on the tremendous legacy that Debra worked so hard on for 30 years. Carol, please come up.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much, Catherine. It's really such a pleasure to join the Greenwich Historical Society at this moment of growth, and certainly with the enthusiasm for the future that Catherine has in leading us forward. I'm also very delighted to be here this evening as we honor my esteemed predecessor and terrific colleague, Debra Mecky. It's thanks to Debra that the Greenwich Historical Society has boldly reimagined the campus that now will provide the foundation necessary to promote the important role Greenwich has played throughout American history. In 2026, as you know, that history will be front and center with the semi-quincentennial, otherwise known as America 250. Thanks to Frank Camillo, our Greenwich First Selectman, who I believe is here with us this evening. It's Fred. My apologies. I've seen the signs all over Greenwich. I drive by them. I know who to vote for. I don't know why I wrote that incorrectly. Well, it is thanks to Fred for tapping the Greenwich Historical Society to lead and coordinate our town-wide efforts, and also for tapping two members of the Greenwich Historical Society board, Tom Galvin and Cynthia Chang, to lead our town committee. Now, beginning in January, we are thrilled to be launching some new exciting initiatives at the Historical Society, and these events and programs are going to bring new ways of sharing Greenwich history. This winter, we are going to launch a winter lecture series called People in Greenwich, and in January, February, and March, we're going to look at all those who came to Greenwich and settled here in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Then in the spring, we have the reopening of the Bush Holly House after the long-awaited installation of an HVAC system and air conditioning, and we'll be rolling out new school programs to all of our schools, public and private, and that's called Rebels and Royalists. I think you're going to enjoy that because we're also going to make sure that it is a family program in the summer. Also in the spring, we are launching our third in a series of America 250th exhibitions called Fashioning America, the first 150 years in Greenwich. And this is going to be telling the story of Greenwich through the clothing in the Greenwich Historical Society collection, most of which has not seen the light of day in more than 30 years. So I think you're going to really be in for a treat. This summer is perhaps one of our highlight treats, and we're grateful to a number of Historical Society friends, 3 of whom are with us here this evening, for helping us to bring the Dutch tall ship Oosterschelde to June. Here in June 28th and 29th. We're going to be having free public tours on the 29th thanks to their sponsorship. This summer, we're also in the Greenwich Harbor going to be launching not only tours, but followed by the fall and our lecture series, which will be on our founding documents. So stay tuned in September, October, and November. We're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and also the Emancipation Proclamation. The 250th is such an important moment in our nation, and I'd love to have you join our efforts unless you're supporting those elsewhere in town. It really makes a difference, the local history that Debra spoke about so eloquently. So we'd love to have you think about helping us with some of our efforts, and on the back of your program, there are codes and links should you wish to either scan or text after this evening and help us celebrate the 250th in Greenwich. Regardless of whether you're supporting our efforts for the 250th or those elsewhere in town, we are delighted that you're joining us here this evening to celebrate the 250th. And as you leave this evening, you will be handed either a copy of the Declaration or the Constitution, and we hope you take those home, remember this evening, and remember what importance those documents held here in Greenwich and throughout America. Now, interestingly, 2026 is not only the American semi-quincentennial, but it is also the 95th anniversary of the Greenwich Historical Society. That's 95 years of working independently to preserve and promote Greenwich history. Now, as Catherine mentioned, we're embarking on a new campaign that goes back to the roots of the work of the last 95 years. It's focused on preservation and education. Again, as Debra said, so critical, especially at a time when our schools are not broadly teaching American history and civics. So in the coming months, you're going to hear more about our plans to restore our crown jewel, the Bush Holly House, and to also introduce to it new technology, new programming, all within its historic walls, to mount a new exhibition program, and also to focus on our gardens and landscape and our green space that has been made possible through that reimagined campus. We're going to bring all these offerings to you, whether or not you're able to take part in them here in Greenwich, or whether you're joining us virtually from a distance. So there's a lot of work to accomplish so that we can make an even greater impact in Greenwich, and we look forward to sharing all those plans with you, so stay tuned. Now, in addition to sharing with you what's on the horizon, I want to also thank each one of you for being with us here tonight, for supporting our current programs, for our exhibitions, and all that makes the Historical Society run. Certainly, the Greenwich Historical Society can't function, much less flourish, without all of your support. So thank you for encouraging us forward with your presence here tonight. We hope to see you again very, very soon. But in the meantime, on behalf of the board and staff and the History in the Making Steering Committee, I'd like to invite you now to enjoy your dinner. Thank you. I truly hate to interrupt what I know are some wonderful conversations, and I want to thank you all again for being with us this evening. But in keeping with this evening's celebration of maritime art and history, we're delighted to have our featured speaker, best-selling author, naval historian, and National Book Award winner, Nathaniel Philbrick, with us. Mr. Philbrick is a graduate of Brown University, where he was the first intercollegiate all-American sailor, and received his master's degree in American literature from Duke University before serving as editor at Sailing World, and subsequently authoring The Passionate Sailor, Second Wind, and Yachting, a Parody. All very appropriate, I think, for Greenwich. A longtime resident of Nantucket with his lovely wife, Melissa, who is also with us here this evening. His books on the history of the island include Away Offshore and Abraham's Eyes, while, as you may know, Heart of the Sea was adapted into the motion picture directed by our very own Ron Howard. Now, equally well known for his novels of the early American experience and Revolutionary War, you might be familiar with his book Mayflower, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His recent work, which I have to say is one of my favorites because it deals with our very first and best president, George Washington, is entitled Travels with George: In Search of Washington and His Legacy. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to retrace George Washington's presidential tour of what had been the former colonies, and illustrates for all of us today how Washington's all-consuming belief in our union really led it to become the nation that it is today, and one that has now endured for 250 years. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you. It is a delight to be here at Belhaven. I can't think of a better setting to talk about George Washington and the importance of the sea in the winning of the American Revolution. And yes, I have lived on Nantucket for close to 40 years, but I grew up in that maritime center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Go Steelers. And it was while in Pittsburgh that I developed an improbable interest in competitive sailing. And when I was 16 years old, I qualified for the Sunfish World Championships in Sunfish. And I participated in the 1973 Sunfish Worlds in Martinique. It was an amazing experience. First time I had seen nude beaches, things like that. And then that summer sailed at Fort Monroe in the Chesapeake in the 74 Sunfish North Americans. And those two areas, the Caribbean and Chesapeake Bay, would prove to be absolutely pivotal in the American Revolution. And it just seems cosmic to me now that here we are approaching our 250th, and I've got the chance to speak to all of you here in Greenwich about Washington and the sea. And, you know, we think of Washington as permanently attached to a horse, someone who is as terrestrial a person as could be. But Washington was in many ways born to be a sailor. He lived in Mount Vernon, named for a British admiral that his half-brother had greatly admired when he served with him a few decades before. Washington's only time off the North American continent was accompanying that half-brother to Tortola, sailing his first time in a ship and probably one of his last times on blue water. But once again, he knew the sea. At Mount Vernon, he had a schooner with a copper bottom, which is the very high-tech thing to have in the 1770s. And when he was stationed in the Revolution, when his army was dug in across from the British based in New York City on the Hudson River, he would often be the one to sail the vessel that was transporting the officers up and down the Hudson. Henry Knox, the head of the artillery, would come to call him our North River captain. North River was the other name for the Hudson. And so this was someone who knew the sea. And in the fall of 1780, the revolution was 5 years in, and Washington and America were at their nadir. In September, Washington had learned that one of his favorite generals, one of the best battlefield generals the American side ever had during the Revolution, Benedict Arnold, had attempted to surrender West Point to the British. as Washington said, turned to the young general who had become a kind of surrogate son to him, Lafayette. He turned to Lafayette and said, "Whom can we trust now?" At this point, Congress was as dysfunctional as it is right now, unable to raise the funds required to pay for this revolution, to pay for this war, and it looked like Washington's army was going to wither on the vine. The American people were tired after 5 years of war. They had lost their enthusiasm that they had had in 1776. The American forces in the South had just suffered a terrible defeat in Camden, where General Horatio Gates literally fled from the field. In desperation, Washington sent one of his favorite generals, Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker, a fighting Quaker. We like them from Nantucket. He sent Nathaniel Greene down south to try to salvage that situation. But what really troubled Washington was that he knew how the only way America could win this war, and the only way they could do it, was with the sea on their side. Washington was the general of the Continental Army, but he realized that whoever maintained naval superiority, and that's what he called it, naval superiority, who commanded the Atlantic, would ultimately win this revolution. Britain had the most powerful naval force in the world. But by 1780, the French had joined on the American side, along with their allies, the Spanish. And the French had suffered terrible defeats in the 7 Years' War that preceded the Revolution. But they had embarked on a program they called revenge. They had established a naval academy. They had applied Enlightenment application of scientific methods to naval warfare, and they had built a whole new group of ships, and they were poised to take on the British Empire. But by entering the Revolution, France and Spain had turned what had been a colonial rebellion into a world war that would stretch as far as India at one point. And we Americans think of our 13 colonies as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. But the actual most important parts of that empire to Great Britain were in the Caribbean, the West Indies, the Sugar Islands of Jamaica, all of those islands. And the French, the same thing, and what we now call Haiti, they had the most profitable sugar plantations in the world. And all those naval ships that Washington had hoped would be fighting on the side of the Americans went south into the Caribbean. Washington lamented because he knew the only way they could win this war is if the French would establish naval superiority on a section along the Atlantic seaboard. His army could move in, and they would then have the potential to win a victory that would force the British to the negotiating table. It was the only way to do it. You had to coordinate the Navy with the land forces. But he couldn't do it unless the French Navy came north. By the fall of 1780, he wrote a chasm had developed between. There was General Rochambeau, a French general, was in Newport with 5,000 soldiers and a small navy, but they were bottled up by the French. What Washington needed was a large naval force to come up from Haiti, go to either New York, where the 10,000 British soldiers were, or potentially the Chesapeake, and stage what could be the victory that won the Revolution. But when would this British Navy come? And then, in October of 1780, right now, my wife is named Melissa, so is the hurricane. And not to say my wife is a storm, but that hurricane has devastated Jamaica and has now moved on to Cuba. It's been called the biggest hurricane in recorded meteorological history But before they were taking records, there was the October of 1780. In my book, In the Hurricane's Eye, in which I talk about the year of Yorktown and the naval battle that would make that victory possible, I describe how a hurricane hit in early October, and how a naval frigate was one of the few, was ravaged by, and they didn't have Jim Cantore, out there saying, the weather is coming. They had no idea what was coming. And this hurricane hit. This vessel was washed up on the rocky shore of Cuba. The men somehow survived and lived another day. And that was one of the worst hurricanes anyone had ever seen. And then, a few weeks later, came another hurricane. I'm going to just read a brief section. On October 10th, what came to be called the Great Storm of 1780 hit the island of Barbados. By the following day, virtually every house, including those built of stone, had been leveled to the ground, and 6,000 inhabitants were dead. Many of the cannons at Fort James were hurled more than 100 feet through the air. The extraordinary surge of water and wind carried a ship so far onto shore that it landed on top of the island's hospital. The hurricane, whipped rain, stripped the trees of bark, indicating that the winds at Barbados must have exceeded 200 miles an hour. A similar scene of destruction occurred at St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Martinique, where a convoy carrying several thousand French troops was blown out to sea. One estimate puts the total death count of the Great Storm of 1780 at 22,000, making it the deadliest hurricane in recorded history. And then, on October 18, 2 days after a Spanish fleet of 74 ships bearing 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Bernardo de Galvez departed from Havana to attack Pensacola, a third hurricane struck, known today as Solano's hurricane for Jose Solano, the admiral in charge of the fleet. The storm ravaged the fleet of the Gulf of Mexico, now the Gulf of America, for 3 days, and ultimately drove the remains of the Spanish fleet back to Cuba. With dozens of vessels sunk and dismasted and hundreds of soldiers and sailors drowned, Solano and Galvez reluctantly decided to postpone the attack until the following year. The lesson was impossible to ignore. Given the seasonal dangers of this storm-battered string of islands, the best place for a navy in the summer and fall was anywhere but in the Caribbean. Up until this point, France had viewed a naval expedition to the north on the behalf of the United States as a possibility, but hardly a priority. After that horrendous October, a different attitude prevailed. And there it begins. Within a year, we will have the victory at Yorktown. And it all has to do with the sea. Washington sends Nathaniel Greene south. It's at that point that General Clinton, the British general in charge based in New York, sends Benedict Arnold, his new brigadier general, to the Chesapeake, to Washington's backyard. This infuriates Washington. Benedict Arnold proves to be one of the best generals now on the British side. He immediately goes up the James River to Richmond, where he sends Governor Thomas Jefferson running for his life, burns the city, and is in the process of building a naval headquarters in Portsmouth, Virginia, when Washington sends Lafayette down after him. Nathaniel Greene heads to the south, battles Lord Cornwallis, who is making his way through South Carolina, and then chases Greene into North Carolina, where they have a titanic battle known as the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The British technically win because they have the field at the end of the battle, but Nathaniel Greene has gutted Lord Cornwallis's army. They limp to Wilmington, North Carolina for provisions and refreshment, and Cornwallis is angry and feels he has to prove that he can fight back and goes into Virginia, where he replaces Arnold and is in a cat and mouse game with Lafayette. Things are happening now in Virginia, where now there, with Cornwallis moving in, there are now an army of more than 7,000 soldiers, almost as many soldiers, British soldiers, as are in New York. Washington pleads with Rochambeau, where is Admiral de Grasse, who is leading the French Navy in the Caribbean? Where is he? Rochambeau has been instructed by the French government not to let Washington know where the Navy is, because at this point, the French fear the revolution is over. The American government has given up. And if they decide to pull the plug on it, it will be de Grasse's Navy that will evacuate de Grasse from Newport. Can you imagine if that had happened? And so Washington reads in a newspaper that de Grasse has appeared in the Caribbean. He says to Rochambeau, "What's going on here?" Yes, I failed to mention that we have a navy of close to 30 ships of the line in the Caribbean, and they're going to come north. Washington says, "Please bring them to New York. If we don't fight the British there, they can take my army and take it down to the Chesapeake by sea, because that's the way to transport people. You don't want to march through the summer of 1780, 500 miles from New York to Yorktown." August 14th, Washington gets a letter from Admiral de Grasse. He is with two senior people from the Continental Congress, and in the letter, de Grasse says, "Hey, I'm coming north, but I'm not going to New York. I'm going to the Chesapeake." Washington was someone who, when he was young, in his teenage years, had an anger management problem. He very famously wrote down the rules of civility. He was someone who recognized, I may not be perfect. I can change myself to try to make myself a better, a more successful person. And he did that. He contained his anger remarkably well, but he never was able to end it. And the two Continental Congressmen watch as Washington erupts, saying words that one of them said cannot be repeated. They think, oh my gosh, has he just melted down? They retire to dress for breakfast, because that's what you did, even though you were living in a tent. And they returned, and Washington was absolutely calm. He had completely resigned himself to it, and he said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to have to march not only my army, but Rochambeau's army that is meeting us, and we are going to march 500 miles into the yellow fever-ridden Virginia. What can you do in Congress to help us? And that was Washington T. So Washington begins the process of trying to fool General Clinton in New York, convince him that he's really attacking New York, when actually they're headed south. They get to Philadelphia before Clinton realizes that this army of 10,000 soldiers is not attacking him, but headed to Lord Cornwallis, who is digging in, creating the naval headquarters that Benedict Arnold had started in Yorktown. It's looking really good. But where is de Grasse? This is before cell phones. This is before the internet. Communication is difficult. As all this is happening, de Grasse is in the Caribbean at Haiti. He needs money. This is also before ATMs and wire transfers. He needs gold and silver coins to pay for this. He asks for the planters in Haiti for a loan. They have plenty of money. They can do it. But the French government has been slow in reimbursing them in past situations, and they refuse him. Saavedra, a Spanish emissary, says, go to Cuba. In Cuba, I will get you the money. De Grasse thinks about it, says it's risky, but I'll do this. I'll sail my fleet of 28 ships to Cuba and see what happens. They sail down the Bahama Channel, used by the galleons 100 years before, but no longer because it's so dangerous. They use that because the British will never suspect that the French would sail their warships up it. They sneak in, are very close to Havana, and in Havana they raise the money, thousands of pesos that will pay for this revolution. Who knew we owed, without the help of Cuba, we would not be an independent country. Off they go. Washington is still desperate for news. Where he has not yet heard of de Grasse. They've just been to Philadelphia. Washington is on his way to Elkton, Maryland, at the head of the Chesapeake, when a messenger stops him and says, it's a letter from de Grasse. I have sailed into the Chesapeake. Lord Cornwallis is surrounded. What? This is it. This has happened. This is Washington's dream now for 3 years, that the French will establish naval superiority. And here they are. The army is about to show up. It's all happening. Washington is so happy. He turns his horse around and rides towards Rochambeau, who's been getting a harbor tour of the Delaware and is arriving in Chester, Pennsylvania. Rochambeau's men see a figure on the waterfront in Chester. He's in the uniform of a Continental officer, and he's jumping up and down. He's waving his arms. He's got his handkerchief in his hand. And they say, that couldn't be Washington. He would never act in such an enthusiastic way. It was Washington. Can you imagine the tension that had led to this? Rochambeau disembarks. Washington wraps him in a hug. And Washington was not a hugger. On they go. They get to Mount Vernon. Washington has not been home in 6 years. The Mount Vernon we know today, with the cupola, with the piazza looking out over the river, was designed and built by Washington from afar during the Revolution. It was the passion project that kept him sane throughout this difficult time. And he's there for the first time and sees it all. Can you imagine? Rochambeau is a little behind, arrives. They spread out the charts and maps on the dining room table at Mount Vernon. And then off they go towards Williamsburg and ultimately towards Yorktown. It is on their way there that another messenger stops Washington and says, the British Navy, a huge fleet, has arrived from New York. The French fleet under de Grasse has sailed out to meet them, and no one knows what has happened. As Washington's aide would say, Washington was very upset because never before in the history, virtually, of naval warfare had the French succeeded in defeating the British. But this would be a different outcome. De Grasse had his fleet lined up at the mouth of the Chesapeake. Those very waters I sailed in 1974 in my Sunfish. The tide was rushing in, and the British fleet was sailing down with the tide. De Grasse could not leave until the tide changed. There's no way they could get out against the tide. So they're sitting there on their anchors, watching this British fleet descend upon them. Finally, the tide changes. De Grasse orders a ligne vitesse, the second time in the history of the French Navy that this had been named, where instead of creating a line of battle that was formed slowly and gradually with a commanding admiral in the middle of it, basically it was creating a floating fort, and the two lines of battle would come together and they would blast away at each other. Instead of doing that, they formed a line in the speed of which they got out there. This was a race to get out there, to be in the vanguard. And reading the logs from the French captains, it was just amazing. It reminded me of a collegiate sailboat race more than it did 18th century naval warfare, where they're cutting their anchor lines, they're tacking in front of each other as they're all struggling to get the honor to be in the vanguard. The French and the British line up. And it's only the vanguard where the real fighting has happened. One of the French ships would fire 268 cannonballs during this furious battle. Admiral Graves would look at his ship of shattered ships and decide, we're not going to save Lord Cornwallis. We're going to head back to New York for repairs. De Grasse sails back, surrounds Cornwallis. Washington and Rochambeau arrive. The siege is underway, and the Allies, the French and the British and the Americans, win at Yorktown. The victory that will win the American Revolution. And so, in conclusion, here we are beside the sea. America, 250 years ago, was a coastal community. We think of the wilderness as defining America. We think of the West. But before there was the West, there was the sea. And it was by harnessing the sea, it was by George Washington harnessing the sea and recognizing, when no one else did, that if you could establish naval superiority and bring in his army and together, you could win this thing. And so, to George Washington, America, and another 250 years. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we can all agree that that was simply extraordinary. Thank you, Nathaniel Philbrick. You have brought history alive for all of us today and demonstrated the importance of history, local, national, and that, of course, by the sea. Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. We want to especially, again, remember Debra Mecky, and thank you so much for being our honoree this evening. We're inspired by your leadership of history here in Greenwich, and we are especially delighted that you can be here this evening as we think about our semi-quincentennial, our 250th. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't forget to take a copy of the Declaration or the Constitution, or maybe one of each as you leave tonight. Thank you very much for coming, and have a safe travel home.